In the quiet neighborhoods of Richmond, Virginia, 1987 began like any other year. Families filled the red brick homes, the James River glistened in the morning sun, and the people of the city moved with an easy rhythm that comes from believing they are safe. But safety, as the weeks would reveal, was only an illusion. It started with one woman, a professional, independent, living alone. When she failed to appear for work, her friends called the police. The officers who entered her apartment stepped into a scene that would haunt them for years. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no obvious struggle. Yet the silence inside felt wrong. In her bedroom, they found her lifeless body. The cause of death was strangulation. Detectives scoured the apartment for clues. The scene was strangely neat. Items were displaced, but nothing was stolen. Whoever the killer was, he hadn't come for money. He came for control. A trace of biological evidence was found, collected, and stored, though few believed it would lead anywhere. In 1987, DNA testing was barely known to most investigators. Days turned into weeks. Fear began to move through Richmond's neighborhoods. Then, another woman was found. The same method, the same eerie order at the crime scene. Her body had been handled with the same deliberate precision. Again, there was no sign of forced entry. It seemed the killer had been invited in, or had found a way to slip through the locks unnoticed. The press called him the Southside Strangler, a name that stuck in the minds of residents and police alike. With every news broadcast, fear deepened. Women who lived alone began staying with friends. Hardware stores reported spikes in sales of locks and alarms. The murders were different from most crimes Richmond police had seen. They carried the cold signature of a calculated mind, someone who planned, observed, and struck only when he knew he could vanish again. The city's detectives worked around the clock, chasing leads that went nowhere. Forensic technicians compared fingerprints and shoe prints between scenes. None matched. But what connected the crimes was that faint biological trace, collected, preserved, and labeled. To most, it was just another piece of evidence. To a few forward-thinking scientists, it might someday hold the identity of a killer. Then, in the fall, the attack spread beyond Richmond. Another woman was found dead in Arlington, nearly 100 miles away. The pattern was unmistakable, same method, same calm order. Whoever this was, he was moving freely, unnoticed, confident. By winter, 4 women were dead. The police had nothing solid, no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, and no suspect who fit all the pieces. Richmond had become a city paralyzed by fear, waiting for a name, a face, a reason. But what no one yet understood was that this case would not be solved by witness statements or intuition. It would be solved by something invisible, a piece of science that would change criminal justice forever. The city's fear had turned into obsession. Every newscast began with updates on the Southside Strangler. Each death followed the same haunting rhythm: a woman living alone, found strangled in her home, often after signs of sexual assault. There was no forced entry, suggesting the killer was cunning, persuasive, or simply skilled at breaking in without trace. The investigators knew they were chasing a methodical mind. He didn't act on impulse, he planned with care. Each scene suggested he had watched his victims beforehand, learning their habits, knowing when they would be alone. The police began cross-referencing burglaries, stalking reports, and parole records, hoping for a lead. Then, an unsettling pattern emerged. The crime scenes were all located within areas that had experienced a string of break-ins years earlier. The suspect in those burglaries was a man named Timothy Wilson Spencer, a convicted felon who had recently been paroled after serving time for burglary. Spencer had quietly, detectives gathered a sample of his DNA. When the comparison came through, the result was undeniable. It matched the evidence from the crime scenes in Richmond and Arlington perfectly. The Southside Strangler finally had a name. But proving it in court, and convincing the world that DNA could identify a killer, would become a battle unlike any before. The arrest of Timothy Wilson Spencer in early 1988 brought both relief and disbelief. To the people of Richmond and Arlington, the Southside Strangler had become more than a man, he was a presence, a nightmare that haunted their nights. Now, standing handcuffed before police cameras, he looked calm, almost indifferent. The monster behind the terror was quiet, reserved, and chillingly composed. Investigators immediately began building their case, aware that this was no ordinary prosecution. They had a suspect, but their most powerful evidence, DNA, was still new, unfamiliar, and untested in American courts. Until this moment, DNA profiling had never been used to convict anyone of murder in the United States. The Richmond Police Department, together with forensic experts, knew they were stepping into uncharted territory. Spencer's background painted the portrait of a skilled predator. Born in Arlington, he had grown up in a troubled environment, marked by petty crime and escalating violence. His teenage years were filled with break-ins and burglaries, and his criminal record had steadily grown before he was finally sent to prison. While incarcerated, he learned patience, silence, and control, traits that later defined his crimes. When he was paroled, he returned to society with a calm surface that hid something far darker beneath. Spencer had found his new form of power, not through theft, but through domination. He chose his victims carefully, studied their routines, and struck without leaving a trace. The evidence gathered against him was overwhelming in pattern but thin in physical proof. His DNA was the only definitive link, yet introducing it in court was a risk. The science behind DNA profiling was complex, and few jurors could grasp it easily. But the investigators pressed forward, driven by the hope that this one innovation could change how justice was served forever. Samples from multiple victims were sent to a specialized laboratory in England, the same one that had pioneered the technique a few years earlier. Scientists compared the genetic markers from the crime scenes with Spencer's blood sample. The results were unequivocal. The probability that someone else shared the same DNA profile was estimated at less than 1 in 700 million. It was the kind of certainty police had never been able to claim before. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they faced the challenge of explaining this science to a skeptical court. Defense attorneys argued that DNA testing was too experimental, too unproven to be trusted with a man's life. But the forensic experts stood firm, detailing the process step by step, how genetic markers were extracted, compared, and matched. The courtroom listened, fascinated and uneasy. For Spencer, there was no visible reaction as the evidence was presented. He sat still, his expression detached, as if watching someone else's life unfold. But behind that calm exterior, his freedom, and the illusion of control he had maintained, was collapsing. The jury deliberated with the weight of a nation watching. Their decision would determine not only one man's fate but the credibility of a new scientific frontier. When the verdict was finally read, history was made. Timothy Wilson Spencer was found guilty of murder, the first person in America to be convicted based on DNA evidence. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, filled with both relief and realization. For the families of the victims, it was justice long awaited. For science, it was a revolution. But for investigators, one haunting truth remained. If not for the microscopic traces he left behind, Spencer might never have been caught. The trial of Timothy Wilson Spencer became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of its time. The courtroom in Richmond was filled with tension. Journalists, law students, scientists, and grieving families all gathered to witness a turning point in the history of forensic investigation. What unfolded wasn't just the prosecution of a murderer, it was the dawn of a new era in criminal justice. The prosecution's case centered entirely on the science of DNA. Traditional evidence like fingerprints, footprints, or eyewitness accounts had all failed to identify Spencer. The defense tried to exploit that, insisting there was no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that their client had ever been inside the victims' homes. But then came the testimony of the forensic scientists, calm, methodical, and unshakable. They walked the jury through every stage of the process, the collection of biological material, the extraction of genetic markers, and the comparison to Spencer's DNA sample. Charts and diagrams covered the courtroom walls as experts explained the concept of genetic uniqueness. Every human, they said, carries a code within their cells, a code that can distinguish one person from every other on Earth. The DNA found at the crime scenes was not just similar to Spencer's, it was identical. The odds of another person sharing that same genetic pattern were astronomically low. Spencer's attorneys argued that the new science was unreliable, that contamination or laboratory error could easily have produced false results. But the prosecution countered with meticulous documentation, showing every step taken to preserve the samples and verify the results independently. 2 separate labs had reached the same conclusion. The numbers didn't lie. As the trial progressed, jurors began to grasp the enormity of what they were witnessing. This was no longer a case built on confessions or circumstantial evidence. It was a case where truth could be measured at the molecular level. The families of the victims sat through every session, their faces carved with grief and endurance. They had waited months for answers, and now they watched the man responsible sit motionless as his fate was sealed by science. When the prosecution rested, there was little left for the defense to stand on. Spencer's prior record for burglary and his movements at the time of the murders aligned too closely with the pattern of attacks. The DNA results provided the final, irrefutable link. In March 1988, after days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Spencer showed no emotion as the decision was read aloud. For the victims' families, the words brought a measure of peace but not closure. The violence he had inflicted had left scars that no conviction could erase. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution emphasized not only the brutality of the crimes but the deliberate nature of Spencer's actions. He had studied his victims, broken into their homes, and taken their lives with precision. The court saw no sign of remorse. The sentence was death. Spencer's defense team appealed, challenging the use of DNA evidence and arguing that the method lacked sufficient precedent. But every appeal failed. The courts affirmed that the evidence had been handled properly, that the science was sound, and that justice had been served. Forensic experts across the world watched closely as the case became a benchmark. It demonstrated that biological evidence could identify a killer more accurately than any witness ever could. By the time Timothy Wilson Spencer was executed in 1994, DNA analysis had become a cornerstone of criminal investigation. Dozens of cases across the United States began using the same method, not just to convict the guilty, but to free the innocent. The Southside Strangler's legacy was grim, but it reshaped history. His crimes, born of violence and cruelty, had forced the world to look closer, down to the smallest strand of life itself, and see truth in a way it never had before. When Timothy Wilson Spencer's reign of terror finally came to an end, the city of Richmond could breathe again. The women who once feared to walk alone at night began to reclaim their lives, their streets, and their peace. Spencer's capture and conviction didn't just close a chapter of horror, it opened a new one in the world of forensic science. It proved that science could reach where lies and shadows once hid. The introduction of DNA evidence changed everything. It became the invisible witness, the voice of the victims, the truth that could not be silenced. Even after his execution, Timothy Spencer's case continued to echo through police departments and courtrooms across the United States. His name became a grim milestone, a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, but it can no longer escape the evidence it leaves behind. In the end, justice was served, not through luck or confession, but through persistence, courage, and the undeniable truth written in human DNA. If you found this story chilling, insightful, or eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dark True Crime, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest corners of human nature.